When both you and the narcissist go silent, the world does not simply calm down. It detonates because in that pivotal moment, someone finally loses control, and it is not you. Most people operate under the assumption that mutual silence signals the end of the story, but the underlying reality is far more unsettling. This is the specific moment when the narcissist begins their true psychological spiral, and it is precisely when your own healing process truly starts. I want you to stay with me because what happens in this space is the part of the journey no one ever prepares you for. If what I am saying is already hitting uncomfortably close to home, please stay with this. You need to fully comprehend the psychological terrain you are stepping onto because understanding this is the only way you can break the pattern permanently. Let us go deeper into this dynamic. When both you and the narcissist stop contacting one another, the very first thing that happens on their side is what I refer to as the recalibration phase. It is a process that is subtle and deeply psychological, and it is something most people fail to recognize because it unfolds in silence behind the scenes long before the narcissist ever makes a move. When you choose to go quiet, you experience it as an emotional shift, a necessary boundary, and a deliberate step toward your own healing. However, the narcissist does not interpret your silence in that way at all. To them, your lack of response is simply raw data. Your refusal to engage becomes something they feel compelled to decode, rather than something they respect as a boundary. They begin to evaluate how exactly they lost their grip on the situation, rather than reflecting on how they hurt you. Narcissists do not engage in self-reflection in the way that healthy, emotionally secure people do. Instead, they perform a cold assessment. They wonder if you just got distracted or if you are intentionally punishing them. They question if someone else has entered the picture or if you are merely testing them to see how they will react. They look for the angle, the hidden motive, and any potential threat to their position. Your silence effectively becomes a puzzle they feel an urgent need to solve because that level of uncertainty deeply destabilizes them. During this recalibration period, they may not reach out to you at all. In point of fact, their quiet is not a sign of indifference. It is purely strategic. They might spend their time watching your online activity, keeping a close eye on your social circles, or observing who is engaging with your life. They are gathering information, patiently waiting for your next emotional move. Narcissists operate on the unshakable belief that the people they once controlled will eventually return to them. Consequently, your silence is not interpreted by them as a form of closure. Instead, it is interpreted as a temporary resistance. This is the primary reason why they do not panic immediately. They hold back, assuming you will break the silence first, just as you have done so many times before. They rely heavily on the patterns they spend time creating within you. They rely on the guilt, the fear of conflict, and the enduring hope for harmony that they know you hold. They fully expect you to fold under the pressure of the silence. When you do not, their internal recalibration becomes significantly more intense. They begin to wonder whether their influence is finally slipping away, and it is in that realization that the threat becomes truly real to them. In the world of the narcissist, silence is never a neutral state. It is always viewed as either an opportunity to re-establish dominance or as a direct danger to their ego. The longer you remain quiet, the more they feel the ground shifting beneath them because your silence effectively disrupts the entire power dynamic they have depended upon. When both sides fall into this state of silence, the emotional experience is dramatically different for you than it is for the narcissist. This stark contrast reveals an uncomfortable truth. You feel the weight of the loss, while they primarily feel the weight of the inconvenience. When you stop initiating contact, you are often left carrying the full weight of what has transpired. You are forced to sort through the emotional wreckage, the broken trust, the unanswered questions, and the profound psychological exhaustion. You may experience waves of sadness, feelings of withdrawal, intense confusion, or even lingering guilt. You are grieving not just for the relationship itself, but for the version of yourself that tolerated such treatment for so long. Your silence is born from a state of emotional saturation. You have reached a point where your mind and body simply cannot handle any more chaos. You are attempting to reclaim your space, your dignity, and your clarity. That internal struggle is incredibly heavy, and it impacts your sleep, your self-esteem, your memories, and your sense of identity. Meanwhile, the narcissist does not interpret the silence through the lens of emotional depth. They do not sit with the loss in the way that you do. They do not reflect on what went wrong, how they caused you pain, or what they might need to change about themselves. Instead, their initial reaction is rooted entirely in inconvenience. Your silence disrupts their established routine, not their heart. They have become accustomed to having constant access to your attention, your reactions, your apologies, your caretaking, and even your arguments. All of that serve to feed their sense of self-importance. When you go silent, that steady stream of validation suddenly shuts off. This does not break them in an emotional sense. It simply irritates them. They experience the absence of supply in the same way someone might experience losing access to a utility or a service they have grown to rely on. It is a disruption, a delay, and a significant frustration. They are not thinking about how they lost someone meaningful. They are thinking about why you are not responding to them. Your pain and their inconvenience exist in two completely separate psychological worlds. You are mourning the death of the relationship while they are busy assessing their access to you. You are trying to rebuild your sense of self while they are busy calculating how your silence affects their ego. You feel the emptiness while they feel the interruption. As time moves forward, this difference becomes even more apparent. You slowly begin to recognize how heavy the emotional burden truly was and how much of yourself you had to silence just to keep the peace. They, on the other hand, begin to wonder why something that used to work so easily is no longer functioning. Your emotional responsiveness, which they relied upon, suddenly isn't there, and this causes them deep agitation. The imbalance becomes visible. Your silence forces you to go deeper into introspection and healing, while it forces them into a state of annoyance and entitlement. The emotional weight you are carrying is profound, while the discomfort they feel is tied not to the loss of you as a person, but to the loss of the convenience of your compliance. When both sides go silent, the narcissist does not experience that quiet as a simple pause or a mutual step back. They experience it as a direct challenge to their ego, because silence from someone they once successfully controlled feels like an act of rebellion. The narcissist views relationships through the narrow lens of dominance rather than reciprocity. Consequently, when you no longer respond, no longer reach out, and no longer provide them with attention, it fundamentally disrupts the psychological hierarchy they believe they have established. They interpret your silence as a deliberate act of defiance, even if your true intention was simply to protect your own peace or to regain your sense of emotional clarity. In their distorted mind, silence is never neutral. It is an affront. It is resistance. It is clear proof that their influence may be slipping away. This is why silence affects them far more deeply than any argument possibly could. Arguments provide them with relevance. Reactivity gives them power. Even your anger reinforces their core belief that they still matter in your emotional world. But silence removes them from the center of the stage. That removal threatens the fragile narrative they rely on to function. Your silence forces them to confront the terrifying possibility that they are not as indispensable, as desirable, or as dominant as they constantly told themselves they were. Narcissists cannot tolerate ambiguity, and your lack of communication creates exactly that, a space they cannot control or decode. Instead of viewing your silence as a healthy boundary, they view it as a provocation. This is the point when their internal dialogue becomes severely distorted. They may tell themselves that you are being disrespectful, ungrateful, or manipulative. They may choose to interpret your distance as a calculated game, assuming you are merely trying to trigger a reaction from them. Their ego leads them to believe that your silence is just another tactic, rather than a sign of your exhaustion or your need for self-protection. Some narcissists will mentally shift into a competitive stance, seeing the silence as a battle of wills that they are determined to win. Others will frame it as a deep betrayal, convincing themselves that you are the one who abandoned them. Even though they may have mistreated you for months or years, they rewrite the meaning of your silence to protect their own self-image, rather than to understand your genuine experience. As this psychological tension builds, the narcissist's sense of control begins to waver. Your silence acts as a mirror, reflecting their own deep-seated insecurity. Rather than sitting with that discomfort, they begin creating complex narratives that are designed to restore their sense of superiority. They may convince themselves that you will eventually give in because you always have in the past. Or they may start plotting various ways to punish you emotionally for not behaving according to their rigid script. In their world, silence threatens their ego because it suggests something they simply cannot accept, the possibility that you may no longer be under their psychological influence. When both sides stop contacting each other, something very different happens internally for the narcissist than it does for you. For you, the silence may eventually feel like a necessary space to breathe, a space to process, and a space to finally understand exactly what you survived. But for the narcissist, your absence creates a kind of psychological vacuum that forces them to confront something they spend their entire lives desperately avoiding: the loss of control. They do not think in terms of mutual distance or healthy boundaries. Instead, they interpret your disengagement as a catastrophic fracture in the system they built to sustain their own identity. Narcissists do not operate from a healthy, internal sense of self-worth. Their self-esteem is entirely externally constructed, held together by the reactions, the attention, and the constant validation of the people within their orbit. Without you there to provide that input, they are forced to deal with the void, and that is why your silence is so incredibly powerful. You were a central part of that system. Your emotions, your direct responses, and your established pattern of returning after every conflict, all of that served to reinforce their deep-seated sense of superiority and influence. When you choose to go silent, you effectively interrupt that cycle. That sudden interruption forces them into a moment of pure psychological exposure. It confronts them with their own heavy dependence on your engagement, which is something they do not want to acknowledge even to themselves. They spent so much time building a narrative where they were the dominant one, the person in control, and the one calling all the shots. Your silence poses a direct challenge to that story. It signals that you may have finally stepped out of the role they assigned to you, and this realization destabilizes their carefully managed identity. Without your reactions, they have absolutely nothing to push against, nothing left to manipulate, and nothing to use as evidence of their own power. This absence becomes a major threat, not because they care about the relationship in any meaningful or emotionally mature way, but because it disrupts the foundation of control that allowed them to feel significant. This is the exact moment when their internal state becomes restless and volatile. They may begin replaying past conversations over and over in their head, searching for the signs they missed. They may start to wonder if someone else has successfully taken their place in your life. They may even start scanning for ways to reassert their dominance, even if they still have not reached out to contact you. The silence becomes much louder for them than it ever does for you because they do not have any idea what is happening on your side of the fence. That lack of visibility robs them of the comfortable illusion that they can predict your behavior. They find themselves suddenly standing outside of your world rather than sitting comfortably at the center of it. That loss of centrality is psychologically intolerable for them. Their mind begins to shift from arrogance to deep-seated anxiety, from a sense of entitlement to intense suspicion, and from a feeling of total certainty to one of instability. All of these things are triggered by something as simple as your absence. When both you and the narcissist retreat into this state of silence, it might seem from the outside like nothing is happening at all. However, internally, the narcissist begins moving through a very predictable series of compensatory behaviors that are designed to restore their lost sense of control. One of the most common reactions is their desperate attempt to fill the void that your absence created through tactics like hoovering, baiting, or triangulation. These tactics are not random at all. They are specific psychological tools that the narcissist uses whenever they feel their influence slipping away. Hoovering happens once they finally realize that your silence is not just a temporary phase. At the very beginning, they assume you will return because that is what they have conditioned you to do for so long. When you do not return, the panic begins to set in. Hoovering is their attempt to pull you back into the cycle, not because they value you emotionally, but because losing you threatens their internal ego stability. They might send you a soft message, bring up a nostalgic memory, or craft a plea that is centered around a manufactured crisis. They may appear to be deeply remorseful, highly reflective, or unusually attentive to your needs. They will adjust their tone to whatever they believe will work in that moment because the goal is not genuine reconnection. The goal is simply reinstating their control over you. If they find that hoovering fails, or if it feels too vulnerable for them, they will shift their strategy to baiting. Baiting is specifically designed to provoke an emotional reaction from you, whether that reaction is positive or negative. Narcissists do not actually care which direction your emotions go. They only care about being the primary cause of those emotions. They might post something on social media that is aimed at triggering your jealousy, send a sharp or dismissive message just to get you angry, or create unnecessary drama that forces you to respond to them. Any reaction from you, even a purely negative one, serves to restore their sense of relevance. Silence strips them of their power, so baiting becomes their primary way of poking the wound they created, hoping you will bleed just enough to remind them that you are still accessible to them. When those strategies do not work, they will often escalate to the stage of triangulation. This is where they bring in someone else, such as an ex-partner, a new interest, a friend, or even a family member. They do this not for any kind of genuine connection, but to craft a narrative that puts them back in a position of control. They might intentionally flaunt a new relationship, hint that someone else appreciates them more than you ever did, or exaggerate your silence to make themselves appear like the victim of your distance. The entire point of using triangulation is to make you feel displaced, insecure, or replaceable. It is meant to lure you back into a position where you feel the need to defend your own worth or re-establish your position in their life. These behaviors are not proofs of love in any capacity. They are clear proofs of their dependence. The narcissist relies on external supply to maintain their sense of identity. When you withdraw that supply, they scramble for any possible way to patch the hole. Hoovering, baiting, and triangulation are their attempts to regain psychological dominance, not to reach emotional closeness. Their reactions are born entirely from fear, entitlement, and ego disruption, all of which are triggered by your silence. When the silence stretches on between both sides, something quite profound begins to unfold that most people do not expect. While you may interpret the quiet as a necessary step toward peace or final closure, the narcissist experiences it as a rapidly growing sense of unease. Your silence is not interpreted as a calm state. It is interpreted as a total loss of control. Because their identity is so heavily dependent on the reactions of others, especially the people they once pulled into their orbit, the absence of your response triggers a kind of internal alarm system. What becomes incredibly important here is understanding that your quiet is not their peace. It is their source of panic. Narcissists rely on constant emotional stimulation from others to maintain the fragile, artificial structure of their self-esteem. They need constant attention, admiration, conflict, and drama. Anything that places them firmly at the center of someone else's emotional world. When you stop supplying that specific energy, they feel an internal collapse beginning. They simply do not know how to regulate themselves without constant external feedback, and your silence effectively deprives them of that necessary feedback. This creates a serious psychological chain reaction. At first, they may try to dismiss your silence entirely, pretending that it does not matter to them at all. They may act unbothered, detached, or even relieved that you have gone quiet. But this is merely a defensive facade. As time passes, the quiet becomes significantly harder for them to ignore. Without your attention anchoring their inflated self-image, they start to feel insignificant, overlooked, and entirely irrelevant. These feelings are absolutely intolerable for them because they strike directly at the core of their biggest fear, the fear of being ordinary, invisible, or unimportant. While you may be using the silence to gather your strength or to rebuild your sense of self, they experience the exact same silence as an emotional void that threatens their entire identity. Your nervous system begins to calm down without the constant tension or the unpredictability they brought into your life. The fog finally lifts. You start to recognize your own worth, and you begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that were suppressed for so long. You find true clarity in the quiet, while they find only chaos. This contrast becomes even more stark the longer the silence continues. They might begin ruminating, replaying past interactions over and over, imagining various scenarios, or inventing complex reasons why you are no longer engaging with them. The uncertainty slowly gnaws away at them. They do not truly miss the relationship itself. They miss the reflection of themselves they used to see in your reactions. And so, while your silence is a path to healing, theirs is a path to destabilization. You find pieces of yourself returning to you. They feel the pieces of their carefully constructed identity slipping away. What feels peaceful and entirely necessary for you becomes agitating and threatening for them. This deep difference in experience is what ultimately exposes the imbalance that existed all along, showing you clearly that the quiet sets you free while it slowly unravels them from the inside out. When the silence settles on both sides, something begins to shift inside of you in a way that often feels slow, confusing, and strangely relieving all at once. Your nervous system, which has been living in a state of constant alert throughout the entirety of the relationship, finally gets a long overdue chance to stop bracing for the next emotional blow. Narcissistic relationships create a chronic, exhausting state of hypervigilance. You learn to anticipate their moods, their volatile reactions, and their deeply unpredictable emotional climate. Your body becomes conditioned to expect tension, even in moments of apparent calm. So, when the silence begins, your system does not instantly know how to relax. At first, it does not know how to handle the peace. You may feel agitated, restless, or even uncomfortable with the quiet. You may even catch yourself interpreting the lack of conflict as a sign that something is wrong. That response is not a sign of weakness. It is pure biology. Your body has been trained to operate in survival mode for far too long. But as time passes, the fog truly starts to lift. Your mind slowly untangles itself from the web of chaos. You begin noticing how your thoughts change when you are not constantly anticipating their next outburst or their next manipulative tactic. Your sleep begins to improve. You start feeling moments of genuine stillness that you haven't felt in many years. This is your nervous system finally recalibrating. It is recognizing that the danger has finally subsided. This is the beginning of real healing. This is the kind of healing that does not require any permission, any apology, or any form of closure from them. This is the moment when you start reclaiming the emotional bandwidth that was once entirely consumed by their endless needs, their demanding nature, and their constant crises. You rediscover your capacity to think clearly, to feel your own emotions without someone else manipulating or invalidating them, and to make decisions based on your own values instead of walking on eggshells. You are finally learning to prioritize your own peace and well-being over their need for attention. This shift in your own internal landscape is the most significant step you will take toward freedom. You are no longer living for them, and you are no longer defined by their chaotic presence. You are finally becoming the main character in your own story again, and that is a shift they cannot stop, no matter how hard they try.